Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. In Russia's genocidal war against Ukraine, culture plays a very important role, as in culture, Ukrainians find a lot of their strength to oppose Russian aggression, and for the Russian invaders, the goal to destroy Ukrainian culture, to impose Russian cultural narratives, is one of the most important ways to subjugate Ukrainians on the occupied territories. But of course, the culture question does not end in the war questions only. It has a pretty wide scale, with Ukrainian culture going back into centuries and even thousands of years. To understand what is this cultural question about and how Ukrainians have managed to find their roots and to create new ways of their cultural self-representation and self-identification, we have invited Olesia Ostrovska-Liuta, who is an expert in culture and cultural anthropology. She's also director of Mystetskyi Arsenal, or Art Arsenal, Ukraine's most important cultural institution. Welcome, Ms. Ostrovska-Liuta.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Happy to be with you.
Thank you very much for having a fun time for this conversation. I remember very well your photograph you have posted on Facebook in early days of Russia's invasion, full-scale invasion in 2020. You have made a selfie in the yard of Mystetskyi Arsenal of your institution in the center of Kyiv, close to all Ukrainian important historical sites like Lavra and the Oskal grave and others. And you have posted back then a message that despite all the threat and Russian bombings and Russian troops approaching close to Kyiv, you still find strength in this place and in this institution. It was a very revealing and a very strong message when you have decided, a cultural anthropologist, a cultural manager, a cultural person, to stay in Kyiv under Russian bombs. What were your thoughts back then, more than 3 years ago?
Well, it's quite a recollection. Well, at that time, the question was, it was March 2022. The question for many people in Kiev was whether you have to flee or you have to stay and do something about the situation. Well, it sounds a little bit grandiose, but when it comes to national institutions, state institutions, basically public institutions, it was a very real question. What happens if you are, let's say, main figure, manager of a hospital or a director of a school? Do you have to flee or do you have to stay? The same question applied to directors of cultural institutions, especially those who are heritage sites and who are the places where national collections are being kept, displayed, and studied. Once you are in charge of something like that, you have to ask those questions. Can you flee as a normal citizen?
But did you understand back then, in full reality of this fact, that if the Russians take Kyiv, you will be killed, because you definitely were on the list? We know now that these lists were very real. We know now that writers, school directors, librarians, cultural actors, they were targeted. They were predestined to be executed. Were you aware of that fact?
Rationally, yes, because this is something we know from the history. I even remember the second day of the war when we moved to the place of our friends, my husband and me, because our place was very close to the front line. So we moved to the place of our friends. When we were just entering their place, there was this very dark joke, and you did have those dark jokes. Our friend opened the door and said, "Oh, come in, let's make it easy for them. We're all on the list. They'll find us all in one place." So rationally, you sort of understood, because this is what happened over and over in history many times. especially in Ukrainian culture, because Ukrainian culture is full of those circles of exterminations. But emotionally, it's very hard to understand. This is when we are looking at our European neighbors today, trying not to accept the dangers that are coming from Russian imperialism, from Russia. We understand that too, because when we were witnessing the invasion, when we were on the front line of the invasion, we still somehow emotionally could not really accept that accept the whole the tragic part of the situation. You understand it. What I'm trying to say is that in such situations you understand things rationally, but it's very hard to adjust emotionally and psychologically. So therefore, you might not be as scared as you would be if you accepted the reality emotionally in its full depth. So I don't know if my answer is clear. I'm trying to say that even at that time, you understood things rationally, but there was an emotional distance to what was ahead of you, and that was mediated by those dark jokes that we had at the time.
I can only try to imagine it. I was not in Kyiv. Back then, I was in Berlin witnessing what is going on, not in communication with my friends who were here.
Well, I have another recollection which will explain how you try to adapt to this situation. On the morning when the full-scale invasion started, my husband and me, we were heading to the art arsenal, and I wrote 2 emails to my team. One email was to my team that is working with the book and literature field, and most of them were staying in Kyiv, so I asked them to draft a letter to our international colleagues explaining what's going on. And another email was to the whole team, asking the team, explaining my colleagues what needs to be done in this situation. And I wrote to them, something like, "Dear colleagues, if you feel that you need to relocate, please do so." And then later, I was thinking about the words that I used. Even by the words, I was subconsciously, I think, downplaying the danger. For example, I used the word relocate instead of the word evacuate, which it was an evacuation, but everybody knew. But somehow the choice of the words was still not of the proper scale.
You mentioned that you have sent one email to your foreign colleagues and partners. We know that it is often a case that Western European, in particular German, actors of culture, institutions, professors, artists, do not quite understand why are Ukrainians so much focused on the creating a firewall between Ukrainian culture and Russian culture nowadays. Was it different back then, and now do you feel that the situation changed, or do you still need to explain your foreign partners why, for example, you don't want to have a good Russian anti-Putinist book writer or filmmaker sitting on the same panel discussion with you?
Well, that's a whole range of explanations. One is that Russian war against Ukraine is a war of both annihilation but also assimilation. So it's absolutely initial for us to manifest the difference. We have to explain to everyone that this is a different culture and a different nation, different society. So this manifestation of difference is important. Another factor is that at the beginning of full-scale invasion, there was a hope and expectation that our Russian vis-a-vis cultural figures and intellectuals will voice up their protest. They will protest against what their troops were doing in Ukraine. And there was very little of that. There were some figures, but it was almost unnoticeable in Ukraine. Then another thing was that we, as Ukrainian cultural scene, we also needed support from our Russian vis-a-vis in terms of analysis of Russian imperial aspirations, political imagination, explaining how imperialist this war is, and that almost never happened, which was, again, a huge disappointment.
What is the reason for that? I'm sorry for interrupting you, but like when you open, and I read Russian, I speak Russian. Russian is my mother tongue. I was born on the territory of contemporary Russia, and I know all these books, and I know that when you open Pushkin or Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or other writers, you will find all the scale of imperialistic narratives. Okay, in Tolstoy you will also find Haji Murat, his later novel where he openly criticized Russian imperialism and calls it by name, but he never published it until he was alive. But all others like Lermontov, etc., Tuchev, you name them, they never tried to hide the idea of subjugation foreign nations, the idea of confrontation with the world as the quintessence of the Russian self-identification. And still, you don't have the discussion in Germany, in the UK, in France. You have only fascination by what is called like great classic Russian literature. What is the blindness? Is it because of the translation or because of the some sort of understanding on the emotional level? Like we were great empires, the Russians are a great empire. We forgive them, we understand them.
Well, I don't know. I don't want to speculate and to go deep into that. What my personal observation is that Russian cultural figures often are not aware, for some reason, that they represent an imperial culture, and they do not often engage into analysis of their culture, and then especially political imagination, which is connected to that culture, as from this anti-imperialist perspective. I do not remember much. There are some voices, very few of them, but it's not as you see it in the UK or Germany or France, where people are engaging into this reflection, where people are studying their museum collections, trying to understand how they become what they are now, what is the role of colonization and imperialism in creating this cultural grandeur, and you don't see it in Russia. So that's an interesting blind spot. To me, it's a little bit like personal. It's a personal perspective now. I somehow feel it a little bit as if I were looking at white supremacy or something like that, when you are not aware of your privileges, and then you do not go into that analysis. When I was in Kyiv during the Russian siege of Kyiv in March 2022, one of the books that I read, paradoxically, was a book by it's a nonfiction by American journalist called Cast. And it's I'm sorry, I do not remember the name right now. It's just not on the top of my head. But it's an analysis of American society from the perspective of the dynamic between white and black Americans, and how whiteness is embedded into the sort of supremacist views, right? How I don't want to be unclear a little bit, but it's analyzing the American culture from this perspective of having one group which is on top on the society ladder, and subjugated groups, and that explained the nature of how some Russians see other people and other nations around them. That was very close to how you used to feel as Ukrainians in those relations. It's as if there is a higher caste and there are lower castes. So maybe I'm being a bit speculative now, but maybe this is one of the reasons why it's so hard to analyze this Russian imperialism from inside Russia.
Still, there was quite another development during this war, during this full-scale invasion. This development was pretty much positive, if I dare to say so. The Ukrainians have found their strength in their culture. And despite all the dangers of Russian shelling and missile attack and even terrorist acts, which Russians tried and are trying now to organize in different Ukrainian cities, your annual event, Book Arsenal, which is a project of art arsenal of Mystetskyi Arsenal, Ukraine's largest book fair, takes place every year. What brings people to this book fair, and what do they expect to find there during this war?
Well, the only time it didn't take place was 2022. We already organized it in 2023. But before I go to the book arsenal, let me react to your words that Ukrainians found their strength in culture. I do not think that's the case in terms of the culture sort of started to be richer or more, you had more cultural production or anything like that. I think Ukrainian culture found its interlocutor. It's not that people on the cultural scene started to do more, or that you had more people on the cultural scene, or that culture became more interesting. I think it's not the case. It just continued as it was, but suddenly you had many more people interested in it, both internationally, but also domestically in Ukraine. This is because in Ukraine, this is happening because more and more Ukrainians suddenly got very concerned about themselves. What are our roots? How we become the way we are? What happened to my family? Why many people asked, for example, how come that my family is Russian speaking while my grandparents were Ukrainian speaking? So what happened between those two generations? And the answers often are in literature and art, in museums, where you have museum objects and explanation and interpretation of those objects. So people got way more interested in that, but it's not because they are more interested in culture. They are much more interested in themselves and what has been their trajectory. So that's why you had maybe more interest to certain phenomena in Ukraine. And secondly, internationally, it was more or less the same thing. Well, as a Ukrainian, having been working in the field of culture for the past 30 plus years, I have never witnessed as much interest as we had at the beginning of the invasion. You usually could not get through. Your voice was usually not heard. And suddenly there was more interest. Therefore, more and more artists and cultural practitioners worked so much to explain, to tell the story, to somehow respond to this grown interest. So my point is that not that suddenly Ukrainian culture blossomed. No, the interest grew significantly.
Of course, Ukrainian art and Ukrainian culture was targeted deliberately by the Russians. We know that people were kidnapped and killed because they were connected to Ukrainian culture. People were killed also accidentally, but they were artists. And effectively, we have seen that people who were very much talented writers, poets like Victoria Amelina, killed by Russian missile, was unable to be the next Ukrainian Nobel Prize winner for literature. Who knows? Because she was killed. And we know that many people went to army instead of writing their books and verses and create sculptures or pictures. It was, of course, a huge negative impact on Ukrainian culture done by the Russians deliberately by targeting artists and indirectly by imposing the general damage on Ukrainian nation and trying to erase Ukrainian nation as a phenomenon, as a cultural phenomenon. But on another hand, like when we look at all wars, like World War One, World War Two, and all other larger wars, we know that wars created a need to rethink this experience, to reflect on it in books, in movies, in other types of art. Is this war, which is still ongoing, is it already reflected in Ukrainian art, in Ukrainian books, or is it still time to come?
Well, war is obviously the main topic of Ukrainian art, both visual and literature and all genres. But whether it's reflected in terms of its presence and artistic activity. But I think we will. Well, my prediction is that the main pieces will be created when there is some emotional distance. We are in the middle of it right now. Many things are changing. Well, something which I, for example, wrote in 2023 is pretty irrelevant by now because the speed is so huge. So you are not able to really get to the bottom of it. So it's still, I think it's still, I hope if we survive, I think this is still to come. And but let me get back to the book Arsenal and why we thought it was so important to have it back in 2023 already. Well, actually, probably the first more significant cultural event in Kyiv after the full-scale invasion was a discussion at the book on the dates traditional for the book Arsenal, and that is the end of May. And on those days in 2022, it was about 6 weeks after Russians retreated from Kyiv, were pushed back from Kyiv. So we thought that we cannot have, obviously, a book fair at that time, right? But we can have a discussion, an event, a public event, where people can gather, can come together and talk about their experience, about what they've been through. But also, to make it more interesting, probably I wanted to say paradoxical, but it's not paradoxical. The Every Book Arsenal, it's an annual project. It's a very large festival, one of the largest in Ukraine, bringing together 30, 40,000 people. So every book arsenal has something we call focus theme. We invite a curator who comes up with the central metaphor, which is also a central question of the intellectual question of the festival, and much of the program is centered around it. So the main question, this focus theme of the book arsenal as it was planned for 2022 was the following. The great relocation. In Ukrainian, this sounds велике переселення. This great relocation in Ukrainian, it also refers to the historical term, the great movement of the people, the great resettling of the people that happened in the early medieval times in Europe. So it was a little bit referring to that. And we wanted to talk about much more peaceful tendencies, such as people changing place to live, their profession, etc., etc. But at the beginning of 2022, this great relocation suddenly sounded as a prophetic idea. So we thought that so many people in Kyiv and many places around Ukraine experienced this again relocation or evacuation. They had to flee, etc., etc. So we need to talk about it. And that highlights the role of culture generally and our mission as well during the war, to be a place where people can speak about their experience and not about something which is more abstract, connected to someone else's experience, etc., but to be together and to speak with each other. Therefore, we did this discussion, our great relocation. It was called Наше велике переселення in May 2022, and suddenly it was still a very empty city. You still didn't have so many people in Kyiv. It was just, after Russians were pushed back. So we didn't expect many people to come, but then suddenly we had a few hundred people in the audience. And a very long discussion. We spoke like for 3 hours, which is unusual for a panel discussion. And we felt that their culture played both therapeutical role, but also its more natural role of creating intellectual grounds for the society. And remembering this experience, we thought that even though it was very hard and unusual, even a bit extravagant in 2023 to have a book fair and a festival, we thought that we will organize it. It was significantly smaller in size than before for security reasons, because as you understand, we have air alerts and bombings, drones, etc. through the day in Kyiv, and you have to have a plan how people can get to a safe place once you have an air alert. It's not easy when you are talking about event with many guests and participants. So it was a complicated operationally complicated project, but we thought that this is our mission, to be the place where people can be together and a place where people can talk about their experience, reflect on their experience, share their thoughts, but also their probably emotions, where we have to be this platform of humanity in a way. So therefore, we started in 2023, and the curator of the focus theme, remember that main metaphor that I mentioned before, at that time was journalist Natalia Humaniuk, Because what we usually do as an institution, we select a figure that we want to invite to create that focus team, to come up with this idea, and then we grant full authority to create that idea to the person or persons we invite. And in 2023, when we invited Natalia Homeniuk, and she came up with this metaphor, it sounded like this: when everything matters. When it's what did she mean? We're in the time of extreme intensity, where it's very high, very hard to create a hierarchy of meanings, to grant one meaning with more significance and another with less. I'll give you an example. For example, when you say an empty phrase, as a person who grew in Russian-speaking region, you will recognize it. When in Soviet times, people used to wish peaceful skies to each other. Мирного неба над головами. When I grew up, it was the emptiest cliche you could think about. Which sounded a bit irrelevant. But since the Russian-scale invasion, those irrelevant banalities, got such a direct meaning. When I wish you a clear sky, that means a lot when you are living in a place where you have missiles and drones every second night. Or even every night, or when there was this wish, I wish you спокійної ночі, a peaceful night, like good night, basically, which is of course a ritual phrase, but then it became so literal. The meaning is literal when someone wishes you a good night or a peaceful night.
That is the same when many colleagues of mine say they don't know or they didn't know what to answer to their foreign partners who started the email with a very standard and actually nothing meaning, "Hi, how are you?" or "How are you doing?" And I was very much impressed by a painting of a Ukrainian artist who just painted an email like in a comic way, like "Hi, how are you?" And then there came like one answer, then deleted, another answer, deleted, third answer, deleted without being sent, and then "I'm fine, thank you."
Yeah.
Because you cannot just explain, "How are you?" Yes, I was sleeping two hours tonight because there were 3 air raid alarms and my neighbor house was hit by a Shahid drone. And this is not something unusual. This is what happens every week for the last 2-3 years. And you cannot answer this to a person who is not familiar with this situation, who asks, how can you go like to a cafe? How can you have a breakfast in a cafe when you have a war? Maybe it's not a real war because you have McDonald's working, etc. And is there a gap of understanding still growing between Ukraine and countries like Germany, France, UK, the US, when people are just incapable or unwilling to realize the reality which Ukrainians face every day?
Well, it's hard for me to say whether it's growing. You are much better positioned than me to tell that, because you are moving between 2 countries. I'm mostly staying in Ukraine. But when you look from Ukraine, it feels that in many European countries, Germany, for example, there is a better understanding of the reality in Ukraine and a war-related reality since the new American administration and the conversation that American security might be removed from European continent. This is when you start to understand things not in an abstract way. Remember how we started this conversation, but in a more physical way, so you understand things better. Otherwise, it's speaking about the book Arsenal. This year's focus theme, which is created by Marcy Shore, American historian, and Ukrainian intellectual Oksana Forostina, sounds as following: everything is translation. And it is related to this question: how do you convey your experience? How can you tell what you are going through? How can another human being understand what's going on? With this war, we suddenly realized that art, even in literature, and all our stories are not very powerful. It's extremely hard to explain this visceral reality. Once the person that your interlocutor doesn't have the same experience, it's next to impossible to convey what you are going through. At the same time, literature and art is probably the best what we have. But then, how do you translate that experience when everything is about translation? Because you have let's say two people. One person says one thing, another person hears another thing, and there are so many, intermediate events happening at the same time. So it's extremely, extremely hard. And it's not something unique that, let's say, people in Europe do not understand the experience of people of Ukraine. This is probably a standard human situation. People do not understand each other directly, and it's hard to understand another human being, let alone when you do not need that, when not only understanding is needed, but also action. If action is looming above you, a human being might avoid any understanding. So this is something that we've been witnessing through this full-scale invasion. On the other hand, look at some of my colleagues here at the Art Arsenal. Some of my colleagues have been displaced for a few times already. A number of colleagues are from Donetsk or Donetsk region, and they had to flee their home already in 2014. And they felt like they were not being understood by people in Kyiv. It's the same country, right? But a different experience. So what do you expect from people in a very, very different situation? Although this situation might be again, very fragile. This looking from Ukraine, peace in Europe at the moment looks very, very fragile. But it's hard to believe in this fragility until it's broken. Remember that word relocation instead of evacuation that I used. I was in the middle of the war at that moment, and still it was very hard to believe into what you are witnessing with your own eyes.
Indeed, indeed. And as the task of culture is to transmit and translate experiences to create some common experience of people, of individuals as a group, as a unit, as a nation, to share experiences, to have discussion between experiences and enrichment of them. It is extremely important to stay on this field and to continue creating pieces of art and sharing them and cultivating this area. There was an interview with Olesia Ostrovska-Liuta, who is an expert in culture and a cultural anthropologist. She's a director of Mystetskyi Arsenal, or Art Arsenal, Ukrainian institution, the largest Ukrainian institution dealing with topics of culture, hosting Ukraine's largest book fair, book arsenal, but also a lot of other projects. Thank you so much, Olesia Ostrovska-Liuta, for this interview. Stay strong, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.